Translator's Introduction. This modest project began in 1995 when I was blessed to obtain a copy of Ibn Rajab's commentary on a hadith narrated by Abu Darda, al-Ulama warathatul anbiya. The scholars are the heirs of the prophets. Having spent more than 2 years giving a series of addresses based primarily on Ibn Rajab's explanation of a series of Imam Nawawi's al-Arba'in 40 hadith, I was no stranger to Ibn Rajab's expansive exposition of a hadith's salient points. But there was something particularly moving and timely about Ibn Rajab's treatment of the famous hadith narrated by Abu Darda. I was inspired to translate the work into English, which I hastily did during the summer of 1995. My intention was to share a work that had touched me deeply with those brothers and sisters unable to read the original Arabic text. Unfortunately, the translation was quite bad, and it quickly found its way to the bottom of a stack of articles and personal papers which I would transport with me during my travels between Syria and the United States. During my years studying in Syria, the reasons that Ibn Rajab's commentary impacted me so greatly began to manifest themselves. Living around and studying with men who exemplified what Ibn Rajab was talking about in his book reinforced the importance of its major themes. Islam, as I was being taught, was an organic whole, comprised at its most fundamental level of 3 integrated components: al-Islam, essential worship, al-Iman, faith, and al-Ihsan, inner excellence. My teachers brought these concepts to life, for they were men most scrupulous in their worship, imbued with a deep and living faith, and most importantly, men who were firmly committed to upholding the torch of inner excellence in a way that made those around them believe that if they could not see Allah, they certainly were well mindful of His surveillance of their every breath, which is a level of cognizance that defines ihsan. These men were the righteous scholars Ibn Rajab was talking about. They were scholars who possessed both experiential knowledge of Allah and knowledge of Allah's commandments. They were scholars whose hearts were detached from the world. Scholars whose erudition didn't prevent them from walking through the cold streets of Damascus immediately after dawn prayer to arrive at the homes of recently arrived students to teach them the most rudimentary aspects of tajweed, proper Quranic recitation, and jurisprudence. These men were truly heirs of the prophets. They were a type of scholar we so desperately need in North America, and they were the type of scholar we pray that Allah the Exalted blesses us to eventually become. Being in the presence of such men stirred me to share my translation of Ibn Rajab's work with a few of my fellow students. The encouraging response of 2 of them, Ibrahim Osiefa and Osama Usman, led me to undertake the gradual overhaul of the original translation. When Osama left Syria to start a publishing house, I made an informal agreement to finish the revision of the translation so that it could be published as one of the initial projects of the fledgling Starlatch. The volume in your hands is the culmination of that process. As I have previously mentioned, this work is particularly timely. As Dr. Abdul Hakim Murad mentions in the introduction to his recently published Selections from Fath al-Bari by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, this genre of hadith commentary has been largely neglected by English translators of Islamic literature. Ibn Rajab would certainly rank as one of the masters of this copious body of literature. His commentary on Imam Nawawi's al-Arba'in is considered by most scholars to be the best and certainly the most expansive. In addition to his unmatched treatment of Imam Tirmidhi's ilal, hidden defects in hadith, he has written a commentary on Tirmidhi's Jami', the compendium, much of which has unfortunately been lost, as well as an incomplete commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari, recently published by Mu'assasa al-Risala of Beirut. His expositions of individual hadith, such as the hadith of Abu Darda, illustrate the breadth of his erudition, the depth of his reflection, and his mastery of all the major Islamic sciences, especially the science of hadith, an area where he was described by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani as the master of his age in ascertaining hidden defects in hadith and investigating divergent chains of transmission. Another of Ibn Rajab's salient qualities, which emerges in his commentary on Abu Darda's hadith and other writings such as Lata'if al-Ma'arif, the subtleties of knowledge, is his deep spiritual inclination. Like all of the scholars of his era, Ibn Rajab was well versed in the science of tasawwuf, that is, Sufism. Although his writings in this regard would clearly be categorized as amali or non-philosophical, he is exacting in his usage of the nomenclature of this science. His confident usage of terms such as ma'rifah, experiential knowledge, zuhd, complete indifference towards the world, ilm al-zahir wal-batin, outer and inner knowledge, and similar expressions is done with the mastery of a person deeply convinced as to the validity of the ideas he is expounding. Despite his manifest Sufi tendencies, in today's highly polarized and overly polemical Muslim world, Ibn Rajab would more likely be categorized as a Salafi. Herein lies the greatest reason for the timeliness of this small volume. There are enemies of Islam who are striving their utmost to split the historical unity of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the community of Islamic orthodoxy. This unity has been predicated on the acceptance of four juridical schools: Maliki, Hanafi, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, and fostered by the acceptance of an approach in creedal matters that holds reason subordinate to divine revelation, wahi. Although scholars in the three former schools eventually came to accept the validity of applying reason and philosophical formulations as means to defend and prove the truth of revelation, this position was generally respected by the Hanbalis, except during infrequent periods of irrational intolerance. Similarly, the scholars of the three former schools respected the general inclination of the Hanbalis in matters of creed, aqidah, to cling doggedly to the textual informed approach of the people of hadith, even though this approach generally discouraged the use of rational proofs and philosophical formulations in matters of creed, thereby limiting the ability of its advocates to respond to the attacks and arguments of the proponents of deviant and alien creeds. This dominant Sunni paradigm was also informed by an acceptance of tasawwuf as a valid Islamic science. This does not mean anything bearing the label tasawwuf is beyond reproach. Ibn Khaldun has shown in his Muqaddimah how elements from Ismaili doctrine and aspects of alien philosophies were introduced into the compilation of teachings contemporarily known as tasawwuf. However, there has always been a basic corpus of doctrines and ideas that provided the foundations for a science of spiritual purification and character reformation, which was accepted by all four of the juridical schools. In this regard, the Hanbalis are no exception. The most widespread of all the schools of tasawwuf, the Qadiriyya, was founded by the great Hanbali jurist Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. His influence on subsequent major figures in the Hanbali school, as George Maqdisi has clearly shown, was to reach the great, if controversial scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, his student Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah, and his student Ibn Rajab. Their acceptance of the basic foundations of the science and their veneration for its early exponents helped to foster, even in this occasionally controversial area, mutual respect between the four schools of Islamic jurisprudence. This mutual respect in turn fostered a unified paradigm which guided the intellectual and cultural life of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and it facilitated a unified and cohesive community. This unity is exemplified in Damascus, where scholars and scholarship of the Hanbalis have always been a vital part of the rich intellectual life of the city's vibrant Sunni community. During the past century, the leading scholar of the Hanbalis, Sheikh Ahmad Ash-Shami, was one of the most respected and loved scholars in Syria. That respect was similarly evident throughout history among non-Hanbali critics of the dominant Sunni paradigm. An example of this can also be taken from the recent history of Damascus. At the turn of the 20th century, Sheikh Jamaluddin al-Qasimi emerged as the intellectual leader of a nascent Salafi movement in Syria. However, Sheikh al-Qasimi situated his prolific and oftentimes critical writings within the dominant paradigm. His writing showed respect for both that paradigm and the scholars whose contributions were instrumental in shaping it. Unfortunately, in recent years, that paradigm has come under attack from within. This attack has been initiated by radical reformers whose strident rhetoric oftentimes signals their own ignorance of the very institutions they target, leveling vicious, largely uncritical polemics against the four juridical schools, tasawwuf, and the validity of rational proofs and philosophical formulations in creedal matters. These reformers are wittingly or unwittingly threatening the historical unity of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. In many instances, these reformers situate their attacks within the historical context of the Hanbali school, relying on Ibn Taymiyyah as the principal referent. This tendency has led in recent years to what could well be referred to as neo-traditionalist backlash. Some defenders of the dominant Sunni paradigm respond to the vicious attacks of the reformers with equal or surpassing venom. In their zeal, some go as far as to attempt to exclude the Hanbali school from the ranks of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, while others, condemning those reformers who declare the likes of Sheikh Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi a non-believer, themselves declare Ibn Taymiyyah to be outside the pale of Islam. If this polarization continues, our heartland, physically and figuratively, will be torn and divided to such an extent that we will never be able to attain the critical mass necessary to re-establish Islam as a dominant socio-political reality. Individuals blessed with cooler heads must prevail. Ibn Rajab is an example of such an individual. He showed that it is possible to combine without conflict the constructs that have come to be known as Sufi and Salafi, that it is possible to be deeply committed to the Sunnah while simultaneously advocating and defending the four juridical schools, and that one can be critical of the formulations of speculative theologians while simultaneously respecting the institutional reality built by their followers. Ibn Rajab is truly an example of the complete, virtuous and righteous scholar he mentions in this important book. He is truly an heir of the prophets. In these troubling and perplexing times, we are in dire need of such luminaries of his kind. A brief biography of Ibn Rajab. Imam Zainuddin Abu Faraj Abdul Rahman ibn Ahmad ibn Rajab al-Hanbali was born in Baghdad in 736 of the Muslim calendar. At the age of 8, he moved to Damascus along with his father. It was in Damascus that he began his religious studies. He first memorized the Quran in its variant canonical readings. He then began the study of Hadith, a study which would take him to Mecca, Egypt, and other Islamic centers of learning. Ibn Rajab took from the leading scholarly authorities of his day. However, he was especially influenced by the great Hanbali scholar Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi. Although he was known to issue some legal rulings based on the opinions of Ibn Taymiyyah, it isn't possible that he ever studied with him, as some people imagine, owing to the fact that Ibn Taymiyyah died 8 years before Ibn Rajab's birth. Ibn Rajab was a leading hadith scholar of his era, an eminent Quran scholar, a jurist of repute, a moving sermonizer, and a major historian. His enduring legacy includes Jami' al-Ulum wal-Hikam, the compendium of knowledge and wisdom, considered by most scholars to be the best commentary on Imam Nawawi's Al-Arba'in, 40 Hadith, Sharh Ilal al-Tirmidhi, explanation of the hidden defects in Hadith, a partial commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari, Al-Qawa'id al-Fiqhiyya, juridical principles, and Lataif al-Ma'arif, the subtleties of knowledge, a beautiful compilation of the religious duties and invocations which correspond to the months and seasons of the year. He has written many comprehensive commentaries on individual hadith, commentaries which amount to independent books. This includes his commentary on the hadith of Abu Darda, the subject of this translation, and his commentary of the hadith Bada al-Islamu ghariba, Islam began unknown. Among his major historical writings is Zail Tabaqat al-Hanabila, appendage to the Encyclopedia of Hanbali scholars. Given to solitude, deeply pious, and known for the abundance of his and intensity of his worship, Ibn Rajab passed from this world in Damascus in the year 795 after Hijrah. It is related that he went to a grave digger a few days before his death and requested him to begin digging. When the digger completed his task, Ibn Rajab descended into the grave, reclined in it, and remarked, "Excellent." A few days later, Ibn Rajab passed on, and his body was brought to that very grave to be interned therein. Buried in Damascus, he left a rich heritage of knowledge. God willing, this book will introduce a small part of that heritage to the English-speaking world. Introduction to the translation. Good translating, owing to its highly nuanced nature, must be considered an art. Like all good works of art, a good translation is the product of a combination of the translator's God-given skills and the fruit of much practice. I don't claim to have an abundance of natural talent in this regard, and since this is my first complete translation, I do not have a wealth of experience. Therefore, I beg the reader's indulgence while encouraging any and all comments and constructive criticism. There are a few points which I feel will help the reader to maximize his or her benefit from this work. First of all, classical Arabic writing tends to be repetitious. This is due to the fact that many of the great works that have reached us were originally lectures, recorded verbatim by the teachers, students, or professional scribes. If the teacher repeated a point for emphasis or for some other reason, that point dutifully found its way into the manuscript. This work illustrates that fact. Ibn Rajab repeats himself frequently. We have decided for the most part to leave those repetitions in the translation. Not only is it more intellectually honest, it also more closely conveys the spirit of the original work. Serious lessons are being imparted here. It should be our desire not only to read what the scholar has said, but more importantly, to learn the lessons he is trying to teach us. Every serious pedagogue knows that repetition is one of the essential keys to successful teaching and learning. Another aspect of many classical Arabic works is the lack of internal structure. Not only are the chapter headings, sections, subsections, and paragraph breaks often missing, many works have no discernible system for indicating when one sentence ends and the next begins. Although in the days when most of our classical scholars were writing, the reader or listener's level of Arabic language would provide that information intuitively. Today, that information usually comes as the result of numerous conscious decisions. I feel the decisions that inform my structuring of this work are good decisions, though they may not be the best possible ones. Therefore, if the work at times seems disjointed, don't let this lead you to an indictment of Ibn Rajab's thoughts. Rather, let it be an indictment of my decision-making in this regard. There are two liberties which I have taken with the original Arabic text, critically edited by Ashraf ibn Abd al-Maqsood and published by Maktaba al-Thurath al-Islami of Cairo. First of all, many Arabic proper nouns and attributions are preceded by the definite article al. We have generally omitted that article, as this is the common practice in many English translations from Arabic. Hence, al-Hasan al-Basri, al-Bukhari, al-Tirmidhi, and al-Madina appear in the translation as Hasan al-Basri, Bukhari, Tirmidhi, and Madina. However, there are some instances where this article has been retained, such as in Ash-Shafi'i. Towards the end of the book, Ibn Rajab relates several biographical sketches and then concludes the work with two poems. I have translated the poems first as an epilogue and then translated the biographical sketches in the form of an appendix. If I have helped in any way to bring this work to life for the many English-speaking readers who will peruse its pages, it is solely due to Allah's infinite grace and mercy. Conversely, if the reader finds any serious problems with this work, they are strictly the result of my own deficiencies. In any case, we praise Allah for the innumerable blessings He has bestowed upon us. In conclusion, there are too many people to thank for their help in the making of this work. They know who they are, and their reward with Allah is sure, insha'Allah. There is one individual, however, I must mention by name, Adnan Arain of Chicago, who provided advice, insights, and criticism which rescued this work when it was in its initial stage. May Allah reward him amply for the time, energy, and effort he sacrificed in that regard. It is my sincere hope that this will be just one of the many fine works of Starlach. Zaid Shakir, May 8, 2001.